Beneath a street in Belfast, they found a woman who died 52 centuries ago with black hair, blue eyes, and the DNA of the Fertile Crescent. She was one of the truest ancestors of the modern Irish, and she had never heard the word Celt. The lab at Trinity College Dublin is smaller than you'd think. Winter 2015. There's a hum from the sequencing machines that never stops. A low mechanical drone you stop hearing after an hour, and the light comes down hard and white on the bench. On that bench sits a single molar. One tooth. Older than the pyramids at Giza, drilled down to a fine gray powder and sealed inside a plastic dish no bigger than a coin. That powder came from a woman we now call Ballinahaddy woman. She was pulled from a Neolithic tomb near the River Lagan, and for a long time she was just bones in a box. Then the genome map came up on the screen, and every marker sat in the wrong place. Here's what I need you to understand about how these maps work. Populations cluster. Your DNA drifts toward the people you descend from, like iron filings toward a magnet. And the whole expectation in that room was that an ancient Irish genome would pull toward Britain, toward Central Europe, toward the Celtic heartland everyone had been taught to expect. It didn't. Every marker that should have clustered north and west pulled the other way. South, east, toward Anatolia, toward the Caucasus, toward the sun-baked river valleys where farming was born. The purely Celtic ancestry that a century of textbooks had promised simply wasn't there. Not diluted, not hidden, not there. Dan Bradley, the geneticist running that lab, had spent his career studying Irish origins. He looked at a screen telling him the founders of Ireland walked out of the Near East, not down from the Alps, and the tooth on the bench had once sat in the jaw of a living woman who ground her grain by hand on the banks of the Lagan. Let me tell you why nobody saw this coming. For over 150 years, the story was fixed, and it was simple. The Irish were Celts, an Iron Age people who swept in from Central Europe around 500 BC, bringing their language, their swirling metalwork, their gods, and their blood. You learned it in school. You've seen it on tea towels and tourist posters, the Celtic cross, the Celtic knot, the Celtic soul. It's one of the most successful origin stories ever sold, and two very different groups sold it hard. The first were the Victorian racial scientists. In the 1800s, these men were obsessed with sorting humanity into neat biological boxes, and a distinct Celtic race, measured by skull shape and cheekbone, fit their taxonomy beautifully. It let the British Empire draw a clean line between the rational Anglo-Saxon and the wild, dreaming Celt on its western fringe. But here's the strange part. The Irish nationalists embraced the exact same idea, just flipped it. If there was a pure Celtic race, then Ireland was its ancient homeland, unconquered in spirit, distinct in blood from the English across the sea. Empire and rebellion, using the same myth for opposite ends. Underneath both sat something older, the Book of Invasions, a medieval origin legend that fixed the whole thing in the popular imagination. It told of the Milesians, Gaelic ancestors who supposedly sailed to Ireland from Iberia, guided by prophecy to claim the island as their destined home. A beautiful story, a prophecy, a voyage, a chosen people. For generations, serious scholars treated that Iberian voyage as pure folklore, a fairy tale dressed up as history. They were about to find out they dismissed the wrong part. So the Celtic theory held. It held through empire and independence, through 2 world wars, through every history syllabus on the island. 150 years of certainty. And nobody could truly test it, because the one thing that could settle it, the DNA of the actual ancient dead, was locked inside bones that no technology on Earth could read. But history is rarely settled by ghosts. It gets settled by patience and by machines finally catching up to the questions. The machine caught up around 2010. Whole genome ancient DNA sequencing, the ability to reconstruct a complete genetic blueprint from a scrap of prehistoric bone, simply did not exist a decade before Ballinahattie woman went under the lamp. The DNA in old bone is shattered into millions of tiny fragments, contaminated, degraded, chemically wrecked by 5,000 years in wet Irish ground. Then Dan Bradley and a young researcher named Laura Cassidy learned to read the fragments anyway. They sequenced Ballinahattie woman, the farmer from 3200 BC. Then they sequenced 3 Bronze Age men from Rathlin Island, off the Antrim coast, who died around 2000 BC. 4 ancient Irish people, brought back to speak. What they said rewrote the whole island's family tree. Start with the ground she was found in. Ballinahattie isn't a lonely grave. It's part of a vast Neolithic passage tomb complex near the River Lagan, a landscape of ritual monuments raised by people who had settled, cleared forest, and farmed. These were builders. They dragged enormous stones, aligned them to the sky, and buried their dead with ceremony 52 centuries ago. That single fact detonates half the old story before we even reach the genetics. Monumental Ireland, the tombs, the fields, the permanent villages, was already being built, more than 1,500 years before any Celt was supposed to have arrived. This wasn't a warrior elite galloping in to found a nation. It was a settled, farming people who were already deeply, physically rooted in the land. I've stood in trenches like this one, and here's what fieldwork teaches you fast. Monuments mean permanence. You don't haul multi-ton stones for a culture you're passing through. The people at Ballinahattie weren't invaders. They were locals, and they'd been local for a very long time. Which raises the obvious question. If these farmers were already here, already building, where did they themselves come from? The answer is written in the genome that lit up that screen. Ballinahattie woman's ancestry traces overwhelmingly to Anatolian and Near Eastern farmers, the people who first domesticated wheat and cattle in the Fertile Crescent, and then spread that revolution across Europe, farm by farm, generation by generation, until it reached the far Atlantic edge. Now the Rathlin men, 1,000 years later, tell a second chapter. Their DNA carries a huge signal of Yamnaya steppe ancestry, horse-riding herders from the grasslands north of the Black Sea. And they belong to the Y chromosome lineage called R1b. Let me make that plain. Your Y chromosome passes from father to son, essentially unchanged, like a surname written directly into your biology, a name you can trace back through hundreds of generations of men. R1b is one of those biological surnames. And here's the staggering number. It's carried by roughly 80% of Irish men alive today. So the modern Irish gene pool was poured in 2 great waves, Near Eastern farmers first, then steppe herders, both arriving thousands of years before the Celtic invasion that the textbooks made the whole point. Which forces a colder question. What exactly did those famous Celts actually bring? Look at what she looked like. The team could reconstruct Ballinahattie woman's appearance from her genome, and it's not the face on the tourist poster. Black hair, brown or hazel dark features, but blue eyes. The specific blue eye variant that first appears in ancient hunter-gatherers. She's a blend standing at a crossroads of migrations, 5,000 years before anyone drew a border on this island. And here is where absence does the heavy lifting. In my field, what you don't find can matter as much as what you do. Comb through these early Irish genomes for a distinct, unmixed Celtic race, a separate biological population arriving en masse around 500 BC to replace what came before. And you find nothing. No genetic replacement event at the Iron Age, no wave of new blood swamping the old, no biological Celts. The Celtic influence was real, but it came as culture, not conquest. Language, art, ideas, moving across trade routes, and taken up by people who were already here, people descended from farmers and herders who'd arrived millennia earlier. The Celts gave Ireland a voice. They did not give it its blood. For a century, scholars treated the Book of Invasions and its Iberian voyage as harmless myth. They were wrong about which part to trust. Because the genetics point south and west along the Atlantic coast, the same maritime corridor from Iberia up to Ireland that the Milesian legend described. The prophecy was fantasy, but the voyage, the sea road from the south, was carrying a memory of something true. A folk story had held onto a migration route that academia had thrown away. So we had our answer. 2 ancient migrations, a settled farming people, a Celtic culture layered on top, and a genome that pointed at the Fertile Crescent. Case closed. The Irish come from Near Eastern farmers and steppe riders, and the Celts were a coat of paint. Except that answer quietly dismantles the question we thought we were asking, because we set out to find where the Irish came from, as if the Irish were a fixed thing waiting at the end of a road. A finish line. A pure people you could locate on a map. There is no such people. What that molar under the lamp actually proved is that Irishness was never a bloodline. It's a meeting place, a stretch of Atlantic coast where wave after wave of humanity washed up and stayed and mixed. The Anatolian farmer, the steppe herder, the old hunter-gatherer with the blue eyes, later the Celtic trader, the Norse raider, the Norman lord. We spent a century searching for the pure Celt at the bottom of the Irish soul. There was no bottom. There was only layer on layer on layer. And this is the part that stays with me. The Victorians measured skulls to prove the Irish were a race apart. The nationalists sang of unbroken Celtic blood. Both were chasing a purity that never existed for a single generation. The genome doesn't show a race. It shows a harbor. The question was never, who are the true Irish? The question was, how far back does the mixing go? And the answer is, all the way down. That reframe doesn't just rewrite Ireland, it reaches out and topples a separate mystery that had nothing to do with genetics at all. The collapse of Ireland's own native population. For centuries, one number has haunted Irish history, the Great Famine of 1845 to 1852. 1 million dead, 1 million more gone across the sea. And the story told, especially in London at the time, leaned on a quiet, poisonous idea that the Irish were a distinct, feckless, biologically separate stock, prone to their own ruin, a race that couldn't govern its own hunger. Charles Trevelyan, the British Treasury official who oversaw the failed relief, wrote that the famine was a mechanism of providence to reduce a redundant population. A race apart, he implied, could be left to its fate. That framing only works if the Celtic race is real, if the Irish are a separate biological kind, sealed off from their neighbors, different in blood. The genome obliterates it. There is no separate Irish stock. The people Trevelyan wrote off as a redundant race carried the same Anatolian farmer ancestry, the same steppe R1b surname, the same deep European inheritance as the men making decisions in London. The line drawn to justify letting 1 million people starve was a fiction with no biological floor beneath it. And here's the cruel symmetry. The Milesian legend told the Irish they were a chosen people, arrived by prophecy, blood pure and destined. The Victorian racial theory told the world the Irish were a lesser race, blood-marked and doomed. Opposite verdicts, identical error. Both built on the same phantom of a pure Celtic bloodline that the tooth on that bench proved had never existed. Ballynahatty woman, dead 5,000 years, buried under a Belfast street, quietly refutes both the prophecy and the propaganda. She is Near Eastern and hunter-gatherer and everything in between, and she is as Irish as anyone who ever lived. So when we talk about identity, This is what the science keeps whispering to anyone who will listen. Every nation that ever called itself pure was standing on a graveyard of migrations it forgot. The tools that read one Belfast molar can be turned on Britain, on Greece, on India, on any people that sings about unbroken blood. And the answer comes back the same shape every time. A harbor, not a hearth. A crossroads, not a source. This is why that lab in Dublin matters far beyond Ireland. It hands us a machine that can test the oldest and most dangerous claim in politics. The claim that some people belong to the land and others don't. Point it anywhere, and the pure race dissolves into the mixing that always came first. The Milesians thought they'd arrived at their destiny. What they'd actually arrived at was a shore where destiny had already changed hands 100 times. A people is not a bloodline that stayed the same. It's a doorway that everyone walked through. If this rewired how you see your own name and your own roots, subscribe. I'm reading these ancient genomes on this channel every week. And tell me in the comments, what origin story were you taught about your people? And do you still believe it? I read everyone,